Welcome back to another AP World History National Review unit. In this case, we're going to do the video lecture on National Review Unit number 6. And this one is on the Age of Imperialism. So, getting all geeky and nerdy again because there's just so much to talk about, so many interesting connections that are made during this time period. And the reason why is because so many of the things that we've been talking about in previous periods are tied into what's happening here. So in this case, there's a clear connection that takes place between the Industrial Revolution of Unit number 5 and what's going on with the Age of Imperialism in Unit number 6. How is this the case? I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I think there's a connection here. Number 1, there is the Industrial Revolution creation of mechanized weaponry, which we'll go over more, but dealing with the Gatling gun, medicine like quinine, and also like the railroad system. Also, there was, at this time period, the need for raw resources. And so because of that, you had both that need for raw resources and a problem called overproduction, in which European countries had to find new markets in order to be able to sell their goods. And then last off, the other huge connection is the justification through social Darwinism. The argument that's made that Europeans had an obligation, because of their superior genetics, to go out and to try to civilize the rest of the world. Now, I think another big thing we do need to go over is how natives reacted to this. Natives in other parts of the world are going to react to this through violent measures. They're going to, in some cases, try to accommodate this kind of a system, and in some cases they did something what's called state centralization. I think what's important about all of these is that the natives were attempting to maintain their traditional ways of life. Okay, here's the big thesis for this particular presentation. Imperialism was the result of nation-states competing over industrialization in the belief that their national culture was superior to those of others. Okay, let's jump into this with imperialism versus old colonialism. So this is a big mistake a lot of students make. They think that exploration during that period of like the 1600s and 1700s is the same as imperialism. It's not. It's sort of like imperialism 1. We're talking about imperialism 2. Imperialism 2 is all about Europeans going out and them trying to find raw resources for manufacturing. So some of the big examples you should remember: cotton in Egypt, rubber in the Amazon and Congo that can be used for machines, palm oil in Africa, guano. This is my favorite. This is basically bat feces. That's right. This is all bat got to do its business, right? So why is that important? Well, they found nitrogen within this bat guano, and that can be used for dynamite, and that was found in Peru and Chile. Meat in Argentina and Uruguay, diamonds over in Africa. Now, why does all of this matter so much? Okay, be careful with this, very important. Imperialism, the Age of Imperialism, is all about the problem of overproduction. What had happened was Europeans had produced so much stuff over during the Industrial Revolution, people just weren't buying it anymore. So the problem is, you've got to find people to buy this. So where do you go to do that? That's right, foreign countries. We've got to find markets. The biggest market, China. There were 200 million people there at that time period. The Europeans developed ways in order to take over to do this, and this ties back into the Industrial Revolution. Best example is the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun was this huge monstrosity of a machine gun. You know, we think of machine guns today in like the Terminator movies, where somebody picks up a machine gun in both hands and starts shooting it. Okay, that's not the kind of gun we're talking about here. This kind of gun was a massive monstrosity of a gun. You'd have one person kind of operating it, another person who would be feeding bullets into it, and then a third person who would help them. And what's important about this gun is that it comes out of industrialization. This is industrialized violence. We also have quinine. Quinine was a drink that Europeans would have that would help to not get rid of the problem of malaria, but slow its progress down. Steel was used at this time period to build battleship fleets. All of this allowed for the conquering of places like Africa. European countries also were going to switch at this time period, by the way, from mercantile companies. You might remember like the British East India Tea Company or the Dutch East India Tea Company. That was when the state controlled that with mercantile companies. But they're now going to switch over to direct control of the colonies through their militaries. Okay, that would be especially the case with France in the West African area. Britain is going to do something similar, except they're going to do something called indirect control, in which they would take people who lived in those areas and put them in charge of the daily efforts, while putting their military ultimately in charge. Okay, So now let's talk very important about East and Southeast Asia. Why? East and Southeast Asia are so important for their markets, especially when it comes to China. And remember, China has 200 million people. In the late 1700s, there was a problem for Britain called imbalance of trade. What does that mean? Basically, the British were buying up tons of silk from China. China was not buying up a whole bunch of tea from Britain. And so because of that, Britain sent out an ambassador in about 1796 called Lord Macartney. He goes out to England and says, I want to have open trade with you, to which the Emperor of China says, that's really nice. See you later. You guys are barbaric. And then we get out to the 1830s. In the 1830s, things are going to change. That's where Britain starts to sell opium to the Chinese in limited markets on port cities. The foreign minister Lin Zexu sees the problem here, that this is creating a sort of what he believed a corruption of Chinese culture. So he says, we're not going to trade with the British anymore. So the British then send in their warships in the Opium Wars. They're going to take over. Now, when they take over, they don't take over China, but they force them into the Treaty of Nanjing, in which they're able to open up more ports. Now, the Chinese are looking at this, and they're just like, okay, how do we solve this problem for the long term? And so a group of thinkers comes up with an idea called the self-strengthening movement. And their big phrase is, you might remember this, their big phrase was, East for essence, West for technical use. What does that mean? Or West for practical use. The idea behind East for essence, West for practical use was that the Chinese would borrow technological ideas from the West, but they would maintain their Confucian identity. Sounds pretty good, right? The leader of China at the time, the real leader, was a woman named Dowager Cixi. And she said, thank you so much for coming up with those ideas. Now we're going to kill you or imprison you. Why? Because she feared losing Confucianism. Now we're going to see something very similar, by the way, in the case of Japan. So in the case of Japan, in 1850s, Commodore Perry from the United States comes over to Japan. Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa. And he says, look, you got a choice. Either open up to trade or we're going to blow you out of the water. So this huge civil war erupts in Japan called the Satcho Civil War. The fight between traditionalists and progressives. Traditionalists who wanted traditional Japanese culture, progressives who wanted to move in a more Western direction. Well, the traditionalists win, but interestingly enough, they start to accept that idea. Now, they don't call it this, but it's the same idea as China. East for essence, West for practical use. In their case, they have what's called the Meiji Restoration. The emperor becomes very strong. They adopt Western industrialization. They build up a Western-styled army, but they maintain their Japanese culture. How? They move the daimyo from the rural areas. They start taxing them. They come into the city. They become a part of a parliament, and that parliament then advises the emperor, sort of like Chinese legalism. So the result in the end of all this, Japan builds faster than anybody in the world when it comes to industrialization. In the 1890s, they get into a war with China called the Sino-Japanese War. They destroy the Chinese and take over Korea. And then in 1906, they get into a war with Russia called the Russo-Japanese War and destroy the Russians. So what they're able to do is they're able to industrialize faster than anybody else. Okay, how did the natives react to all of this? Well, I'm going to give you a few different ways that they react. Number one, we saw violent resistance to this. For example, in Western Africa, we see the Queen Ya Asantewa, who basically tells the men of her tribes and kingdoms, you guys aren't fighting against the Europeans, I'm going to do it for you. And she organizes an armed resistance against the Europeans. In Peru, we see a huge uprising led by the man Tupac Amaru. At first he's pretty successful, but then he's defeated. After his time period, though, his relatives take up that fight, and they start to fight against the Europeans. And then we see an Islamic violent reaction in the Sudan by a man named the Mahdi. The Mahdi is able to kick out the Egyptians and take over that area. And eventually what happens is the British are going to come in and they're going to take over. A second reaction is accommodation. A good example of that is the Cherokee Nation here in the United States. The Cherokee Nation see that they need to accommodate American culture in the American government. And so they start doing something in which they have a written constitution. They adopt Western farming. They even have African slaves at the time period. It's not going to work out for them, though. Eventually, the Georgians, living in Georgia, find gold right where the Cherokee Nation is, and it leads into what's called the Trail of Tears, in which the Cherokee Nation is removed from that area and moved out to Oklahoma. We also see an attempt to retain traditional culture. Here's a third way that people resist. How did that take place? Well, a good example of that happens again in America. It happens with the Sioux Indian up in the Dakotas region, the Montana region. There we have a man named Wovoka who was going to call for something called the ghost dance. The ghost dance was a belief that if you did a certain dance, the ancestors would come and they would protect your tribes against the American cavalry. This led to the massacre at Wounded Knee, in which over 100 Native Americans were killed. Also in Africa, we had the Xhosa cattle movement. This is where a young girl believed that she had had a vision in which she was told that if they killed off all the cattle in this area, the ancestors would rise up and protect them against the British. Well, unfortunately, what this did cause was a massive famine in which many of the Xhosa ended up dying. Last major thing that happens during the Age of Imperialism is migration. And there is migration around the world. I can't stress how important this is. We tend to look at immigration as sort of like it just happens. People move from place to place. Migration was happening because of imperialism, because of the systems of imperialism. For example, there was movement within empires due to the empires making political decisions. Empires at this time period sent people out in settler movements to actually settle in these areas to find markets and raw resources. New Zealand is a good example of that. Britain used Australia as a penal colony, which they sent out people who were prisoners out to these areas to give them a chance to rehabilitate. We have indentured servants. So we have two systems of indentured servants. One comes during the time period of colonialism, in which people would actually pay to have somebody come over and work for them in their house. But this kind of indentured servitude happens after that time period when slavery ends. When slavery ends, you have people who are moving around to different places, working especially on plantation labor. So what happened when you have people moving around the world like this? Well, what tended to happen was something called nativism, in which local populations made the argument that the people coming in could not truly be of the culture of their local native population. Two big examples of that: the Chinese Exclusion Act in California in about 1896, in which the Irish in California got very upset at the Chinese, who they claimed had stolen their jobs and making up the railroads and could never truly be American, which is ironic given the fact that the Irish themselves have been called the same way off on the East Coast. They were able to pass a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which then led to a national law which excluded Chinese people from America until the 1960s. The White Australian Act. Yes, the White Australian Act, that was the name of it, in Australia was an attempt to keep out both foreigners who were coming in, but also to claim that Australia was a white country and that Aborigines should not be given equal citizenship. Okay, what are our takeaways for this age of imperialism? Number one, it's important to note the connection between the Industrial Revolution and imperialism. Our big connections here are overproduction, the look for raw resources, and the use of science. Number two, natives reacted in multiple ways, but the commonality was to maintain their traditional cultures. And number three, international migration was not an accident. It was the effect of the economic systems of imperialism. All this is so important, and it connects into the next unit, talking about how we get to World War I. Okay, see you in class.